Hi, everyone. Welcome to the Hammer Museum. I'm Claudia Bester. I'm the Director of Public Programs here at the Hammer. Thank you. Very kind. I'm so thrilled to welcome you here to tonight's reading by author Mona Simpson and conversation with Mona and Evan Kleiman. Tonight's talk is part of our long-standing literary series called Some Favorite Writers, which is a co-presentation of the Hammer Museum and the UCLA Department of English. And tonight we're honored to present a new novel by one of my favorite writers, Mona Simpson. Mona's the best-selling author of Anywhere But Here, The Lost Father, A Regular Guy, Off Keck Road, My Hollywood, and Casebook. And thank you for the reminder. Please silence your cell phones. She's a professor of English here at UCLA, and in 2020, she was named publisher of the Paris Review. She is also the host and curator of the Hammer's Some Favorite Writers series, through which she's brought so many wonderful authors to read here at the Hammer for over 15 years. And I and the Hammer and our audiences are very, very grateful to her for that. Mona was reluctant to read here lest it should seem like she was using the series to plug her own work, but please know I had to beg her to read her new book tonight, and I'm very persuasive. Her novels have not only given me much pleasure over the years, but I've also learned a lot about myself through their characters, kind of like doing therapy through reading. And they've been very helpful and somehow strangely reassuring too. Tonight we have another wonderful author with us as well. Evan Kleiman is the author of several very popular cookbooks, and she's also a former chef and restaurateur. Most of us know and love her as the host of the wildly popular and groundbreaking radio show Good Food, which she's hosted on KCRW since 1998. Love that show. But many of us also know and love her as the owner of the beloved Anjali Cafe on Melrose, which was my favorite restaurant in LA. And don't just take my word for it, it was always on Jonathan Gould's top 100 list as well. Anjali Cafe was open for 27 years, and I can still taste that amazing special bread that they gave you in my mind. I love it so much. Evan is also a voracious reader, and she and Mona got to be friends through talking about books. So it's perfect that tonight Evan was able to join Mona to talk about Mona's new book, Commitment. Commitment was published last month by Knopf. It's about how 3 children find their way to adulthood after their mother is institutionalized for depression. The Washington Post describes the book as a minimalist masterpiece, exploring the large and small ways that a diagnosis of mental illness affects a family. In a story utterly devoid of car crashes, murders, abductions, and explosions, Simpson bears down on the truly important questions about life: home, work, love, and family. Commitment makes the case in a quiet but insistent voice that our lives do matter, even if other people think they're broken. So now let's hear from them. Please join me in giving a very warm welcome to Mona Simpson and Evan Kleiman.
Hello, everybody. Ooh, what a nice crowd. You enlarged yourself at the last minute. Welcome. I'm Evan Kleiman. I'm so happy to be able to talk to my friend Mona about her latest book. You know, Mona and I are in a book club together. And this is a very special experience for me, especially because this book, how many of you have already read the book? This is the kind of book that you read and it doesn't leave you, which to me is just a marvelous, magical thing that can happen as a reader. When you read and you go about your day after you put the book down, but the book continues to haunt you. And I hope that we get to talk about all the reasons why that happens. I love this book. It's a look at the American dream kind of from the underside. And there are parts of this book, given that it takes place in LA in the 70s and UC Berkeley in the 70s, that made me feel very seen. So, thank you, Mona. So let's jump in.
Let's.
The title, Commitment. Why? I mean, it's a really interesting device, but it's also a really shattering way to look at a family. To have the center of the story be this situation in which a parent is committed, and then the children kind of are left to fend for themselves to a great degree.
That is true. It's a strange book in a way. One writes these things and thinks about them as you're going along, but you think about it in a different way when it's over. And one thing that is, there's a kind of hole in the center of the book, and that's her experience. And I sort of wanted to imply a lot about the person who's depressed's experience from everything around her. I didn't manage to, I didn't do her experience of it. And about the title, I had trouble with the title. I'm one of those people who either has a title right at the beginning, which I've had for a couple books, and then I'm thrilled and I keep the title for the whole time, or else I have just pages and pages of ideas for titles. So this was one of the latter.
At the center of the story is Diane. She's a divorced single parent with 3 children who struggles mentally and financially. But everything she has goes towards feeding her children's dreams.
That's true, and her own dreams for them. She's definitely got a sort of a vision of what she hopes will happen to them. She gets them into, she kind of cheats with the districting and gets them into a school they don't really belong to, and does what she can, to make that happen. She believes that they'll be safer, that they'll be better educated, that they'll be better able to do well in the world if they have an education. It's funny, a friend of mine read the book when it was finished and said, "You're really, either you or your characters are really a believer in education." And this is a friend of mine who dropped out of college and later went back, I think, and got an MA at Yale in cultural studies. But I realized how far I'd come from the town where I grew up, where before I moved to LA as a child, I lived in a factory, an industrial town, Green Bay, Wisconsin, where basically nobody I grew up with would have questioned the notion that education was the way out. And yet, mysteriously, when a lot of people came to that juncture in their lives when they could have gone to college, a large number did not. And for a whole complex of reasons, but one of the reasons was also the intoxication of having been in a very materialistic world where they were not given things. It was intoxicating to get that first job and actually have a paycheck.
Yes. One of the things that really struck me in terms of the children, the parent lying to get their kids into this
School.
West Side School, the school. And so the children become complicit in the lies. Excuse me. There's 2 threads of the book that rub up against each other constantly, and one is the part of the mental illness, the disappearance of the mother, and the other is the poverty. This kind of free-floating, kind of just trying to make your way through and find a way. And the way that you handled the poverty of these characters is extraordinary and very unusual, because often writers will fetishize characters who are poor. This felt so unbelievably authentic and kind. There is an air of kindness that permeates this book. Can you talk a bit about that? Because what you're talking about are characters and situations that are really, really tough, and it could have been easily harsh.
Well, I hope it's even in a few places funny. But although I was trying to find a little short reading that was funny, and I realized with most of my books I have that. And I couldn't find one today. It was very funny.
To me, one of the funniest things is just when the youngest child, Donnie, is going through his crisis involving addiction and then going through a 12-step program, and no one will accept his amends.
That's true. He has a hard time getting takers for that.
People love him so much that they just can't accept that, that he's really needs the amends.
I mean, it's funny, I do write a lot about being poor in America, and it's a weird thing because actually, as an adult, I mean, this is a funny thing about growing up with a parent who maybe struggled with some mental illness, although I interviewed a lot of psychiatrists and retired nurses and so forth from Metropolitan State Hospital, which is the closest state hospital to here. And they assured me that my mother didn't qualify for, they didn't think she was mentally ill, that she, because she managed in the world, and she did, but she struggled a lot.
But she did finally break down.
Many times, I think she broke down, but she did work. I mean, she did meaningful work. She was a speech therapist. She taught people to talk again after having strokes, and she was gifted at that. But I mean, in terms of just managing the world, it's a striking thing to grow up with someone for whom it's just hard, and you can tell it's hard. It was hard for her to have a job. It was hard for her to maintain a car. It was hard for her to have food in the house. Often, she didn't manage to have food in the house, not necessarily because she couldn't afford it, although she definitely wasn't wealthy. But it was just hard. And yet, as an adult, I mean, one of the things with growing up with someone who struggles that way is I've had a really lucky life as an adult, because it was never that hard for me to find a job. I mean, not necessarily a great job, but even in my 20s, I managed, and it didn't seem hard. I had a lot of fun along the way. So it's funny that I keep writing about that, that childhood experience doesn't completely leave you, but I see it everywhere around me, especially now. I mean,
that's the other thing that struck me reading this book is the reality for these characters in the 70s and 80s is so much different. And I thought in terms of the kindness that permeates a lot of this story, I wonder if it had been set now, if it would have been so.
Well, I said it then because, one of the things with a book that takes 1 year, I'm sure there's a lot of writers in the room, I see a lot of them, and I don't know for everyone, but for me, for a book that takes years, usually I enter it through a couple different doors, and one of them was just, I wanted to write about this young person going to college who ostensibly has this equalizing life. You go to college and everybody has a dorm room, everybody eats in the cafeteria, everybody takes classes, everybody falls in love, everybody, finds their people. It's kind of a beautiful, expansive moment in life. But I know from teaching, and I know from myself having been there are a whole lot of students who are going through those experiences too, and having those experiences, but also have a whole separate drama and narrative going on in their heads about, what's going on with their family at home now that they've left, and how will their family be okay? And so that was one way I started the book. But another way is Oliver Sacks, the great neurologist writer, wrote an essay that just struck me, and she published, I think, maybe 15, 20 years ago, called The Lost Virtues of the Asylum. And it was really kind of an eye-opener for me, because I assumed, like most of us probably do after seeing One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest and a whole raft of movies in the 70s and 80s, I assumed that the institutions were just completely soul-crushing and cruel and awful, awful places. And several of these movies would have people leaving in the end to sort of more free and sensory, thrilling lives. And Oliver Sacks actually went back and traced the history of how these hospitals started in Europe and how they started in America and what the ideals were. And he also read a lot of books written. There's a lot of books written by people who were in asylums who actually had a good experience, who had, a smaller world and a safer world, and in some ways a restrained world, but also found that to be comforting and fulfilling for them and meaningful. So I found myself sort of wondering whether that might have been a better thing.
And then one also thinks that now a woman who was afflicted with the kind of recurring depression that Diane has perhaps would just be on an antidepressant, and a lot of what she deals with would lift.
Well, unfortunately now it's even worse than that. I mean, a lot of people who would have been in mental health hospitals in the 70s. The reason I said it at that moment is because that's sort of the last moment you could have been there. There's very, very few beds right now that are for ill people who are not forensically charged to be there. They've really turned into forensic hospitals.
And in fact, we see that arc happen in the course of your book, that the hospital begins to change.
Yeah, no, they in 1963, Kennedy signed the Mental Health Act. He had good reasons for signing it. He had high hopes for it. And basically his vision was, of course, he was assassinated a few months later, so he wasn't around to push the legislation through Congress that might have made his vision possible. But his vision was that these big hospitals, which had become very overcrowded, would close, and what we'd have instead would be community mental health systems, community, smaller places that would be run, set within communities and also run by doctors and do a lot of work. What happened is that Congress allotted the money to the states in the form of block grants. So as one of the nurses told me, states had the choice between highways and mental health, and in most cases they chose highways. And basically less than half the amount of facilities that were envisioned were ever built. And so that's where we are now.
There are three siblings, and the three siblings give you an opportunity to take these characters through this experience in three very different ways.
Yes.
So Walter, the oldest, is the one with the most intact education and the most protection from his mother, because he had her the longest. And then there's Lena, the middle child, the daughter. Talk a little bit about Lena.
Well, I'll say this, that the first time I turned my book in, my editor, who's in her 80s now and I love very much, said, Lena doesn't have a soul yet. So I spent another year or so and worked on Lena until my editor felt she had a soul. I think that the oldest child had a lot more confidence, and Lena, being the second child, she had a couple different things going. She had some of the experience that I was talking about in terms of she got a job. She didn't get into college right away. She applied only to her first choice colleges, didn't apply to a safety school, and in fact did not get into her first choice colleges. So she got a job in a department store. Remember those,
Doing windows.
Yes, and she had a good time there, and she made friends, and she was liking it, and going through the ranks. They were going to send her to become a buyer, but she also was plagued a little bit, the way sometimes the same-sex child can be, with feeling that her mother's illness was also perhaps in her, and that it just hadn't expressed itself yet, that it was waiting, and that she too would suffer from the same thing when she got older.
For me, one of the really most gutting parts of the book is when the eldest, Walter, he's found his path, which was originally to be a doctor, but then as life happens, it changes, and we find him very focused on making choices that will make him wealthy, give him protection. And the family is sinking when Diane is committed. And there's that whole interchange between him and Lena, and he asks her, is it better if I come, or do you just want money? Do you want me to leave school and come back and help you and the family, or do you just want me to send money?
And she says, well, maybe the money. Because he has a bunch of jobs lined up for that summer where he is. And so he knows he can send some money. But she doesn't know. I mean, she doesn't know what she's doing. She's a kid, you know. It's funny. I had a student once who took some time off and came back, and I asked what it was, and she said her mother had died and she just needed to get herself together for a few years. And I was so impressed by that, and I realized that so many people don't do that. They just soldier through, and Walter just soldiered through.
Could you read a little bit for us?
Sure. Reading glasses. So nice to be here. I've been elsewhere, and this is the end of my book coming out. It's so nice to be home place. So thank you all for coming. Okay, I'm going to read a little bit. Where did it go? Here it is. So Walter, when he goes to college, has, a great experience, and he sort of falls in love with his roommate. They become great friends. He falls in love with a pair of roommates down the hall, one of whom he imagines undressing every night before he goes to sleep. Everything's going great. He discovers a passion for architecture, but then, still in his first quarter at school, he realizes he finds a bill in his mailbox from the school and realizes his mother has not been able to make the dorm and cafeteria payments. And so he owes a lot of money. And then he confronts his mother and realizes she really can't afford it. So by now, this is later, but by now he's still in college, and he's picked up a couple of jobs. He works in a suit shop called the Princeton shop. He also works in the architecture library, where there's a big architectural model of the whole campus of Berkeley, and the development office brings over patrons whom they hope will fund new buildings in spots they've allotted for expansion. So he's there at the beginning. The next millionaire wore what Walter had learned to recognize as a bad suit. Walter asked where he was from, just to say something. Marin Woods. Where are you from? Who, me? Walter's fingers opened on his chest. I'm just a work-study student from LA. I don't know what I'm doing either, the man said. I'm not going to donate a building. The kid who walked me over said it wouldn't help my daughter get in, no matter what I gave. State school, he said, regulations. My daughter's not sophisticated like some kids. She's grown up with animals and nature. I think a lot about her and my wife after I'm gone. Do you have just one child? Just the one. I married late. She's a junior in high school. And she's been through a lot. Her mother suffers sometimes from depression. M. Ball walked in, and Walter got up to get the tea and coffee. When he returned, the man was touching a tiny building on the model. He was Walter's favorite millionaire so far. The afternoon opened in the panoramic window, gray clouds over the hills with patches of blue and gold showing through. When the man left, Walter followed him to the elevator and asked, "How did you make your money?" There was a pause. Nobody, Walter supposed, likes you to mention their wealth. Well, the man said, that's a long story. Maybe I shouldn't have asked. No, I was a little taken back. Heck, I suppose I wanted something from them too, hoping to give my daughter a leg up. It's just, can you think of a way I could make $1 million? Now the man laughed. He pulled a wallet from his trouser pocket and extracted a card. Come to my office. I'll take you to breakfast. As the elevator doors started to close, Walter jumped in. "You must be good at school," the man said, "to have gotten in here." "I'm okay. I make money selling bikes." "Tell you what, for success in business, you don't have to be a genius." A valve opened inside Walter. He held on to those 7 words. But between the December afternoon he took Lawrence Wimmer's card and the morning he climbed the steps to his office building a few weeks later, the world changed. Walter had to go to LA for a crisis with his mom, just when she was supposed to be nearly well. The doctor had never given them an exact date for her recovery, but Julie and Walter both thought it would take a year from around last Christmas. Walter had been counting down the months. The night he got the call from Julie, "A problem, your ma, you better come," Walter jumped on a bus. He didn't tell his friends. His family never held still. His mom had been improving, he thought. He'd been worried about his sister Lina. Walter thought of Julie's apartment. Her cats, he recalled, stalked everywhere, even on the table. This time, though, she'd penned the cats in the kitchen and made up the living room couch for him. All night long, light slanted in from a street lamp. In the morning, Lina looked older, better than last time, but too much makeup and ridiculous shoes. She didn't look like a student anymore. Donnie was quiet, shuffling. "You coming along?" Walter asked. But Julie said Donnie couldn't miss school before finals. Well, Walter had finals too. Why didn't she ever worry about him? They drove with the windows open. His mother had settled nicely, Julie said. God, it's over a year now. She was doing her flowers. Then, starting this past summer, she was always with that lady from Pasadena. I could never get her alone. They had little jokes between themselves. Once I thought they were making fun of me, and I said to myself, well, crud, here I drive all the way down. So I asked what they were laughing about. Your mom whispered, "Ward secrets." And then I thought, maybe it was good that she made a friend. I liked her having someone to sit with at meals when I wasn't there. They could go to that little beauty shop open Tuesdays. I made sure she had cash. I didn't see this coming. Julie stopped talking. Then a startling thing happened. She began to cry. Walter wasn't used to being alone with Julie. She lifted a bald napkin to her eye. Your mom kept saying that woman from Pasadena was the first lady, that the president didn't want her in Washington. It was too dangerous now. Things were going on the public couldn't know. The Pasadena woman nodded along. She'd probably told Diane in the first place. But then the Pasadena woman got transferred to a facility nearer to a nephew. Your mom said the president had sent for her to join him in the White House. She told that to the other women on the ward, too, because when they watched the news and the president came on with Betty Ford, one said, "Where's your friend, Diane?" taunting her. Your mom said that Betty Ford on TV was really an actress. And there was that one attendant she never liked. I'm sure it wasn't as bad as that attendant said. She said your mom hit her and then bit her. Hit her and bit her my foot. That attendant's a whiner. She has the arm bandaged up so you can't see. Her wound is probably a mosquito bite. His mother was in a different building now, in an unfamiliar part of the property. The hospital was on a large parcel of land among old trees, but the place today felt ill-built and untended. Even the grass looked poisonous. She was fine before. I don't understand. I know it, Julie said. They made their way to the ramshackle building where Julie asked for Walter's mother by her full name. A nurse, preoccupied, pointed them down a hall of polished linoleum. They found her on a cot covered by a sheet, her wrists and calves in worn leather restraints, her ankles swollen, bare feet sticking out. The skin under her eyes appeared bruised. She wouldn't look at Walter. Mom, what happened? He touched her shoulder. Nothing, a small flinch under the skin. She exhaled audibly then, as if disappointed but not surprised, and shook her head, as if everything was too futile to explain. You can tell me, I'm on your side, you know, Walter said. She shook her head again, stubborn, as if to mean nothing they could do would get it out of her. She kept her eyes on 2 points on the wall. "It's Walter, you're Walter," Julie said in her overly enunciated whisper that sounded like scolding. "He took the bus down from Berkeley to see you." The new way Julie talked to his mom made Walter inordinately sad. A nurse ducked in and wrote something on a clipboard. Walter asked when the restraints would be taken off. The nurse looked up as if he'd asked what time it was. "The doctor should have been here already. He's late. He'll come in the next few hours." The next few hours? He's late and he'll be here in the next few hours? Walter didn't know until the end that he'd been shouting. The nurse shrugged. "Welcome to hospital time." His mom fell asleep. Julie stood up, rubbing her pants legs. "I'm antsy. Maybe I'll walk over to her ward and bring something for her to wear tomorrow." Walter stayed where he was. Surprisingly, this was easy, like settling deep in a hole. It was plain that he needed to sit here and wait. Eventually, the doctor would come. Walter wanted to see him, though he felt furious that he was late. He heard noises, distant and close. Even with her drugged, he liked being next to his mom asleep, hearing her breathe. Walter stayed in the chair between the bed and the wall while the light changed on the ceiling of the small room, as noises clanged and then subsided in the dormitory behind him. Nurses poked their heads in and left. They were together, her sleeping and him sitting. And in that period, Walter made peace with everything that had happened to her and would happen still. And he understood that she did not blame him for being unable to stop her fall, but appreciated that he was there and wanted forgiveness. She'd been here a year and 2 months. At first, there'd been the scare of other people and the medication. Then she'd seemed to settle into a primitive safety. She did her flowers, she ate eagerly. She was heavier than she'd been, and careless of herself, and she seemed less interested in them, her children. Walter accepted this too. Maybe she was, as the doctor once said, still in the beginning of her illness. Perhaps the illness had a life even he couldn't see. This was the end of a belief Walter hadn't even known he possessed. He'd grown up without religion. When his roommate had asked him once if he believed in God, he said he didn't think so. But he had trusted something to bend the far end of time to his favor. He no longer had that feeling. Julie returned with a small, foreign-looking man who had a thick mustache. With a tool, he unlocked the restraints. Last, he unbuckled the thick belt around her waist. "We'll have you out of here lickety-split, Diane." "It's about time," she answered. She still didn't look at Walter, but he felt warmth fall on his left shoulder. "You'll be back in Ward 301 soon," he said. "I promise." Walter's lips felt big inside. How had it come to this, that the best hope was a return to what had once seemed unbearable? "I didn't want Donnie or even Lena here to see this," Julie said. Walter couldn't answer. He nodded. For the rest of his life, he understood that experiencing his mom's humiliation had changed him. Thanks.
This is a crazy question, I'm sure, but what was, as you were developing yourself as a young woman, what was the initial impulse to write?
That's a good one. That's a hard question. God, I don't even remember because I think that started when I was really young. Like maybe high school or something, and I always thought that was just something I did. That I liked to do, but that I assumed I would have to do something more lucrative and stable. I still sometimes think I should do something more lucrative and stable. But for me, the big conflict was, would I go for it as a main thing, or would I keep it protected as something I did, but not try and do it professionally? I thought maybe, that, and a lot of people choose that, and that's a good choice too. But
Like Lena.
yeah.
Um, one other thread that goes through the book that I find really powerful is this idea of the way one meanders through life and the way that decisions happen almost like happenstance, like the way Walter got courage to take that business card and ask that very bald question of how do you make $1 million? And the way Lena just morphs from doing windows and decides to have, or not even decides, is driven to have the art practice.
I think it's like that a little bit, don't you think? I mean, things are crazy. You know?
I do think, but I think now, watching parents, that and the way things are going at universities, how people are trying to think of universities as job training sites.
That is true. I sometimes go to graduation and have been accosted more than once by a mother who says, will you supervised my daughter's thesis. Will she be able to make a living? Her sister is in Harvard Medical School dental. And will this work out? I was lucky in that way. I mean, my mother, though in some ways unstable, she wasn't that way. I mean, she was delighted that I wanted to do something like be a writer. I mean, she would have been delighted if I she would have probably accepted whatever I wanted to be. And she also wasn't sort of hip to it. Like, I remember I got my first grant or something from the Guggenheim, and somebody said, your parents must be proud. I was like, it would have never occurred to me to call my family for something like that. That just wasn't, I didn't have that kind of pressure. But
That's kind of a blessing.
It was a blessing. There was a blessing of just, they were on a different channel, in a different place.
I mean, it's very strange that...
I mean, I will say, this was a while ago, too, and I think her main concern was that, I remember she came to where I was living in New York at the time, and the main concern that I wasn't sort of looking nice enough to get married, probably. She would encourage me to unbutton. I had the one mother who would unbutton my blouse. And she would say, that's just not sexy at all. She was right, I'm afraid.
Can we talk about Julie?
Sure. I love Julie. She's one of my...
Julie is amazing, and
my favorite character
and
in the
she's the net. This story would have spooled out quite differently if there hadn't been a Julie. So putting her there was...
And she was a complete surprise to me. She's, for those of you who haven't read it, she's a woman who was another nurse who was a very good friend, sort of a work friend of the mom's. And it was one of those friendships where I think everyone has one of these. And we probably are each on either side of this kind of friendship, where Julie was probably a little bit more invested in the friendship than Diane was. Diane was sort of the more glamorous.
Part of me felt like she was
one.
in love with Diane a little bit.
I felt that she was in love with Diane a little bit, or maybe even more than a little bit. But and she knew Diane had these children and had a different life and a bigger life. But she really had a lot of fun with Diane and treasured the friendship. And then this terrible thing happens to Diane. And she's both very concerned for her friends, but also for her friend, but also steps in to help with her kids. And Julie didn't have kids, and didn't particularly. I don't think of her as somebody who wanted kids. In fact, she didn't in my vision of her. But once she had this responsibility, she became particularly close.
Well, she took on the responsibility. She didn't have to.
No, she didn't have to at all. And the kids know that as well. And particularly, she became close with the youngest child, who really immediately sort of took to her. They had an immediate connection. And he didn't have any issues of loyalty. He found, to his surprise, he could love two people in the same role at the same time and had no problem with that.
Would you read just these two short paragraphs, the highlighted part?
Sure, I'm going to have to get my glasses again.
I'm sorry. So this is about the youngest child, Donnie.
Oops. These phones, I can't control them. The last brutality was Donnie. The worst part was his acceptance. Other people go, Walter's there. I'm looking forward to, oh, this is when, I know when this is now. I'm sorry, I started too late. Okay, where are we here? So as their mother, should I start here?
Yes.
Okay. As their mother sinks into immovable depression and doesn't get up from bed, Lena and Donnie are left to fend for themselves. This is not from the book, but this is a description. Walter is doing this thing and hasn't sent any money since the
No.
no.
Sorry.
I'm sorry.
That's the problem with the phone. Okay. Here, just these.
Okay. The last brutality was Donnie. The worst part was his acceptance. Other people go, Walter's there. I'm kind of looking forward to some time alone, being less watched. This is what he says to his sister when she's going off to college. She feels bad to be leaving him. He was trying to make it easy for her. Julie and Donnie were better people. Virtue was a luxury Lena couldn't afford yet. This is what high school kids did in Los Angeles during the 70s. They packed themselves into cars on cold nights and drove to Santa Monica, then trudged through the marine layer toward the loud waves. They lit fires in pits already dug out, lined with ashes and bits of charcoal wood from older embers. They cooked hot dogs on long sticks and roasted marshmallows with a somber air. A few kids had cars, many more jammed into them. Others hitched rides home. Most stopped at Ship's all-night diner for hot single-dish pile-a-mode before returning to their sleeping, troubled houses, which seemed more peaceful in the dark.
Yeah, so I found Donnie really lovely, and also the fact that all three of them find love. All three of them become connected to another person. They're not left sort of hanging.
That's true. And then they'd find different kinds of love, and Donnie maybe is the luckiest in that, I think.
Why?
He just has that in him. He just has that capacity.
To me, he had the most emotional intelligence.
Yeah, I think he's gifted in that way. He has a gift for attachment,
Yeah,
which is a beautiful thing to have.
beautiful. So you start the book and it's one thing, and of course, by the midpoint, it becomes something else. And by the midpoint of this book, I kind of started to wonder if commitment is kind of the end point of a continuum that many of us feel with our mothers or fathers, kind of that weight that's out there, sometimes lifting us, but often this burdensome feeling of caring that we must have. And as we get older and we move away into an independent state, that weight can become niggling. It can just kind of eat away at you, something we block out and we forget that's there. I don't know.
That's interesting. No, I think the issue of worrying about one's parents is very real. In fact, I think that's one thing that happened. That's one reason why it's sort of a tragic thing, but one reason why Foucault wrote this book about insanity, and he kind of linked things to the architecture. He said when the leprosariums were emptied out because leprosy was cured, they had these empty buildings, so they put in the poor, the criminals, the insane, and to some extent, what happened in America was these mental health hospitals opened, and people drove their elderly parents and left them there. And that's one of the reasons these hospitals became incredibly overcrowded. So when Kennedy, started emptying out, and when the institutions started emptying out, that gave rise to this huge industry of assisted living. So I mean, care for our families is just, we don't have it down. We clearly don't have it down. Things are a little better in some communities of America than others. In Latinx communities and Black communities have a slightly more connected rate of parents being cared for by their children, but it's not something that's going to probably go reverse.
In the process of researching the book, you had many conversations with the noted psychiatrist, Bolas.
Oh, yes.
Can you
I'm a
talk
great
it-
fan of his.
Could you talk a bit about him and the tenor of your conversations, what he kind of brought to you to create this?
Well, in writing a book of fiction, I'm so interested in the little moments between people and sort of the emotional tempers of their lives that but you want to be credible. You want it to be credible too, and so I talked to him a lot about depression, and I just wanted to make sure that I wasn't doing something that was fictionally right but not accurate. And he's just such a wise man, and it teaches one so much that any conversation with him goes.
I mean, I
many
went
places.
down a huge rabbit hole of reading his stuff after
It's
I read
great.
it. Yeah, just really great. Maybe it's time we turn for
Yes.
questions. So the person with the microphone is going to choose. So raise your hand.
Hi.
Just want to say, first of all, that I thought what you said about Danny's sort of emotional intelligence, that he has a gift for attachment, was really beautiful. I'm interested in this thread that was sort of picked up before your reading about research and theory, as you mentioned Foucault, but also about kindness. And I'm wondering how reading theory, as well as trying to recontextualize your experience in Los Angeles through research, sort of lends itself to a kindness with your characters and the way that you process your fiction.
It's funny. Kindness. I was just thinking of kindness because I just actually performed a marriage ceremony for the first time, and I quoted Henry James, the great Henry James, who said, "There's only three things are important in life. The first is be kind. The second is to be kind, and the third is to be kind." And I think we all kind of know that, but in a way you don't believe that when you're 25. And in the same way you don't believe in plot when you're 25. But you actually see plots, you see endings to things, and you see that later. And so I think that's true. I don't know what else to say about that. I mean, I did a lot of research for this book. People do research all kinds of different ways. I wouldn't necessarily even recommend the way I research. I over-research, and then I cut 90% of it out because you don't want too much. Research can be a toxic thing in a novel, but you learn a lot, which is one of the great things about it. I was a journalist for 2 years after college. I started as a poet, then I went to fiction and thought, well, maybe fiction was more viable. And then I went to journalism to support my fiction. It was this sort of food chain, none of which was doing much in the way of support. But the thing I loved about journalism was you just got to explore these other lives, and you learned so much. And the great thing about research for fiction is you don't have to worry about a lead, or you don't have to worry about being scooped. It's not like that. You're going for what you really need from it. So I hope that answered your question.
Thank you. Is there another?
My students, please ask a question. Thank you.
Thank you. So with this novel, you have these three siblings of, each in slightly different stages in their life. And I just wondered if that was a conscious choice to choose these three ages and these three stages, or if they just kind of came to you as that, or if it was conscious.
No, it was a little conscious. They sort of made themselves known as they went along. Their characters were a little less conscious, but and it's it's a third person, but it definitely goes into three different points of view. But it's not like a Rashomon story. It's not three different points of view about the same thing at the same time. I sort of used each of them I used their perspective for the time in their life they came to terms with what happened with their mom. So that's sort of the internal logic I had for it. Thank you, Jade. Jade just wrote a wonderful
ringer.
senior project.
Good evening. First off, I just want to say thank you so much for you both being here. My question is just to piggyback on that. When you're done with this piece and these characters, you told their story and things, how does that feel for you emotionally? Like, yes, you're reading pieces from it, but like, I feel like you're so intimately engaged with them, and like, just for yourself, what does it feel like to now close it up? And I don't know, like,
Well,
where do you see them, or do you dream about them? Do you continue to write about them?
No.
Okay, I'm just curious.
It's funny, you definitely do live with them when you're writing it. But the funny thing about the way that books are published, at least here and now, is that, I finished this book over a year ago. So, yeah. So it's been a long time now since I was deep in that way. And I was for a number of years, but now I've got other characters I'm thinking of.
But from your I just have to interject for a second. Do previous characters from older books ever pop up? Are you ever haunted?
I've usually got newer characters that I feel like not as much. People do that, and they write good sequels and all that. I feel like I feel like I know what the rest of my characters' lives are after the book ends, and I try to. I feel like that's sort of in the ending. I feel like it's in the book in a way. So I feel like, in a way, everything I know about these characters is in the book. So they don't haunt me in quite the same way. I feel like
Do
they're
you
done.
begin with character or with plot?
Definitely character. I don't know if I even ever get to plot. This is my ambition. I want to get to plot. Mr. Ramsey wanted to get to Q. I want to get to plot.
Anyone else?
Hi, you said, I think, that the book was inspired in part by your mother. So I wondered when I was reading this why you decided to write the book at this point in your life rather than earlier.
I grew up with a single mother, and it was just the two of us. And in some way or another, I'll probably every book I write will in some way be inspired by my mother, because it was just such a profound relationship. I mean, it's when I feel like my mother gave me my life and saved my life. She was the person in my life. So she will always haunt my books, I think. But this book wasn't, I didn't think of Diane as my mother. I didn't think of the mother in this book as my mother. I thought of it sort of as, another way that it could have gone, another way that her life, my life could have gone. I've thought that sometimes. When I read that Oliver Sacks piece, I just thought of the struggle that she had, and I thought maybe it would have been better for her to be in a smaller, safer world without having to make a living and raise a kid and do all that by herself, which was very hard for her. I think it would have been worse for me, but better for her. But that was the question I started the book with, or one of the questions that was in the mix. And I don't know, I think you do come back to some of your same obsessions.
Hi, I'm Michaela. I'm a writer and I'm 25, so I take offense greatly to what you said about plot.
I'm sorry, Michaela.
I'm totally joking. So I'm a big fan of your short story Lawns. That's actually why I'm here. It's just one of my favorite short stories of all time.
Oh, thank you.
Yeah, and I really love it because the protagonist, I won't spoil it for people if you haven't read it, but the protagonist goes through something so challenging and disturbing in our society that we rarely speak about it, right? And I like this short story because I think you did a really good job of not sort of feeding into what people call trauma porn, right? Where you describe what this character is going through and the pain that it's caused her and how that led to certain actions that she repeatedly takes, despite the risk. And so I was wondering, how do you balance, in this example, right, with another horror that happens in society, right, like the parentification of children? How do you balance those, like, how do you balance not feeding into trauma porn with still showing the truth of these stories?
That's a good question. I mean, I have to say, I've read about trauma, I've read, but I'm not sure exactly what makes something trauma porn. You know what I mean?
Sorry, to clarify, people describe trauma porn as, something like unnecessarily graphic in our depictions of certain traumatic events.
I know what you.
It's
That seems right. I mean,
Yeah.
it seems that you're sort of using the depiction of a traumatic thing to actually titillate the audience in some way or thrill them. Yeah. Yeah. I think art never wants to do that. I mean, it's funny. I taught a class. UCLA tells you, how you do on your class responses. And some people did not think this was my finest moment as a teacher, but I did a class called Narratives of Predation, and of course, one of the books, I actually didn't start with Lolita on the list, but people wanted to read Lolita, so we read Lolita. And a few people in the class really objected, but I would make the argument that the scenes are not titillating at all. They're actually very bleak. And so I think that's what you want. I mean, there's nothing romantic about cruelty ever. And I think, anybody who's trading on that is not trying to make art. They're trying to make, I don't know what they're trying to make, blockbusters of some sad sort, some sad kind. But thank you for reading that. That's an old story of mine. It's a funny story too. It's a story that I grew up without my father, so it's a story about incest. And it came out of, after college, I tried to be a journalist for 2 years, and I did a long, like months-long investigative piece on this incest treatment center in San Jose. So I participated in groups with girls who'd been molested and with their fathers and with their mothers and their siblings. It was really interesting. I then wrote a long piece on it, a journalism piece, and I sent it to Bob Asaina, who's here, at the New York Times Magazine, who rejected it. Oh well, but it then was published by the San Francisco Chronicle, but they took out parts that weren't trauma porn at all, but that were just truthful, and their theory was that people didn't want to read that with their Sunday morning bagels. What can you do? This is why we go to fiction.
Hi. Earlier you were talking about how this story was about your mother and how you think your mother will always haunt your works. And I've heard the saying that writers throughout their life always write different versions of the same story. But I wanted to know, what about this story was unique and what about it surprised you?
Yeah. I probably shouldn't have said that. I'm not sure it's true that I'll always write about my mother. I hope not. But, I mean, I think that, this story was definitely very made up. It wasn't my experience. But, gosh, that's hard for me to tell. I feel like it's almost not, it's not for us to decide what's unique about our work. Maybe it's not unique, I don't know. But all I can really say at this point is it's the best I could do, It's what I was driven to write about. It's what was sort of given to me to write about, and I did the best I could with it.
The thing I would say about your writing is that your characters are fully inhabited. You manage to write about humans in a very full way and
Thank
with
you.
kindness.
Thank you. We probably have time for maybe one or two more questions.
Question over here. The question is, why did your characters didn't get into the herbal world and decided that they wanted to use herbs or the natural way of curing their mental illness, or the kids working using the herbal form?
What if the sort of an herbal treatment was tried?
Yeah, and what your characters didn't use that as an alternate choice?
I don't know. I'm big on herbs, but I grow them and stuff. But I'm not sure anyone has found them yet to really make a dent in serious depression, unfortunately. Well, I'll want to hear about that, because I think it would be great to have some less invasive treatments.
Maybe one more.
Did you have a question over there?
Hi.
Hi.
So I am a former creative writing student who now finds myself in a doctoral program with writer's block. So now I just want to ask your advice on writer's block for those of us who are working on long projects, and I'm in that moment where I feel like I've lost some steam on it. So what things do you do to revive your interest in a project?
That's a good question.
Cook.
That's a great answer. For me, I guess what I do is, I think there's different kinds of writer's blocks. I think, in a way, if you're really sort of doing what you usually do and giving yourself the time to work and reading what you need to feed your work, if you're doing all that and you're still blocked, then I would sort of respect the block and think that it's something real and something you need to let your unconscious work on. So when that's happened to me, I've swerved and worked on something else for a while, and then sometimes the opening will come to me, the invitation back in will arrive. If you're blocked because you've let your life become chaotic and you're doing a million other things, or your family has come for 2 weeks, or any of all those things that happen, then I think that's a different matter. So I think you have to differentiate. But I think with long projects, there are periods where you come to a wall and you need to step back and give yourself some perspective and give your unconscious a chance to bring up what you really need.
I want to thank you for
Thank you.
sharing so much of yourself.
Thank you. Evan,
What?
thank you so much. And you should announce the pie contest.
Yes, I'm going to announce the pie contest. So on Sunday, all of you are invited if you are a pie person, or if you just like to hang out in the sun on a beautiful university campus. Good Foods pie contest, which used to be annual, but this is the first time we're getting together in over 3 years, is happening on Sunday. It's free. It's on the quad between Royce Hall and Powell Library. We have 500 pies entered. You get to taste them. There's an enormous pie tent, there's DJs, there's games for children, there's a cooking stage. It's a very fun,
Are recipes available?
probably some. Yeah, I mean, all you have to do is Google Evan Kleiman and pie, and recipes just unfold. But yes, please come if you're looking for something to do on the weekend and you want to be outside and just have a good time.
Say again what time it is, Evan.
It's from 12 to 5.
And it's right to which part of Royce? The south, north?
It's on the quad,
It's on the quad.
right in front of Royce Hall, in between,
Between Royce and the library.
Yeah, Royce and the
Great.
library, yeah.
It's our quad.
Exactly. My former quad. So now Mona will be signing books, and you are encouraged to buy them for her to sign.